Welcome to the deep dive. The date is March 4, 2026, and if you are looking at the global markets right now, you are basically watching the entire world economy just essentially hold its breath.
Yeah, it's incredibly tense.
It really is. I mean, we're stepping into a scenario today that geopolitical strategists and energy analysts, military planners, they have been warning about this for literal decades.
Right. It's the nightmare scenario.
Exactly, the nightmare scenario, and it is no longer theoretical. It is unfolding in real time as we speak. So our mission for this deep dive is incredibly specific, but it's also massive in its overall scope.
Huge scope, yeah.
We need to completely understand the cascading real-time effects of this rapidly escalating conflict currently engulfing the Middle East. But we aren't just doing a broad overview today.
No, we really need to drill down.
All right, we are focusing intensely on one very specific geographic reality, and that is the functional closure of the Strait of Hormuz. We're going to break down exactly what this means for global trade, for international energy security, and very specifically, we're going to explore the unique, frankly severe exposure of the Indian economy to this sudden crisis.
And to do that properly, we are drawing on a deeply comprehensive stack of intelligence and analysis today. We have real-time maritime intelligence reports from Windward and Skuld.
Which are just fantastic sources.
Oh, absolutely. They're providing us with the hour-by-hour reality of what is actually happening to ships right there on the water. And to track the financial fallout, we are diving into economic analyses from the Federal, the Guardian Upstocks, and TMGM.
Lots of financial data to get through.
Exactly. We are also utilizing think tank briefs from Trends Research and New Security Beat to map out the geopolitical shifts, alongside some really detailed logistics reporting from Triton to see exactly how the world's supply chains are actively breaking down and attempting to reroute.
It is a literal mountain of information to synthesize.
Yeah.
But before we get into the timelines, the destruction on the water and the sheer panic in the markets, we need to pause and establish some very clear ground rules for how we are approaching this material.
Yes, this is absolutely critical. For you, the listener, we need to explicitly state that the materials we are unpacking today cover an ongoing, highly sensitive, and intensely politically charged military conflict involving the United States, Israel, and Iran.
Right.
We want to make it unequivocally clear that in this deep dive, we are examining these events entirely impartially. We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing any political, strategic, or military actions by any party involved in this conflict.
Not at all.
Our role today is strictly to report and analyze the factual content contained in the provided source material. We are focusing purely on the economic, logistical, and geopolitical realities that these documents present to us.
Yeah, exactly. We are looking at the data, the trade routes, and the market reactions. Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this by starting with the geopolitical trigger that set this entire global shockwave into motion.
All right, the initial spark.
Yeah, we have to rewind just a few days to February 28, 2026. According to the intelligence briefs in front of us, this was the day the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iranian military targets. The operation is being referred to in the documents as Operation Epic Fury.
Operation Epic Fury.
And the retaliation was not just immediate, it was staggering in its geographic scope, wasn't it?
It was a massive regional escalation. Within hours of operation, Epic Fury Tehran responded. They launched immense retaliatory missile and drone strikes. But the critical detail here is that they didn't just target Israel.
No, they went much broader.
Exactly. The intelligence reports indicate that Iran targeted U.S. military bases and allied infrastructure across the entire Middle East. We are looking at confirmed strikes in Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia.
Hey, well, let's just pause on that list for a second. Bahrain, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Iraq, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. That isn't a localized conflict.
Not at all.
That is the entire energy-producing heart of the globe suddenly becoming an active war zone. Basically overnight.
Precisely. And while this military exchange is happening across 7 different sovereign nations, there are massive seismic shifts happening internally within Iran's leadership.
Right, which the documents highlight.
Yeah. The think tank analyses highlight this as a major, deeply unpredictable, destabilizing factor. We have confirmed reports of the death of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Wow.
And immediately following that, the announcement that Ayatollah Alireza Arafi has been appointed as the interim leader.
Which, even in peacetime, a transition of power at that level would be a generation-defining news event. It would have markets completely jittery.
Absolutely.
But happening in the middle of a multi-nation regional war, It introduces a level of volatility that makes forecasting almost impossible.
And the volatility is expanding outward. The conflict has officially moved beyond a bilateral or even trilateral exchange. Hezbollah has formally entered the conflict.
Right, opening another front.
Yes. They began launching sustained missile and drone barrages directly at Israel immediately following the news of the Supreme Leader's death. In response, Israel has initiated a campaign of airstrikes targeting Hezbollah-controlled areas in southern Beirut.
So you have a multi-front, multi-actor conflict that has essentially placed the entire Middle East on a war footing.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the absolute geographic center of our deep dive today, the Strait of Hormuz. Because while the missiles are flying over capital cities across the region, it is what is happening in this specific, incredibly small body of water that has the global commodities markets in an absolute panic.
It's the ultimate choke point.
It really is. So help us visualize this. What exactly is the Strait of Hormuz, and why does a conflict there matter to someone listening right now who might be sitting thousands of miles away?
Well, to truly understand the Strait of Hormuz, you have to picture the primary circulatory system of the global energy economy. Geographically, it is a narrow waterway situated between Oman to the south and Iran to the north. It is the only sea passage from the Persian Gulf out into the open ocean, connecting to the Gulf of Oman and eventually the Arabian Sea.
So it's the only exit door.
The only one. And at its absolute narrowest point, the entire strait is only 21 miles wide.
Just 21 miles. I mean, that is roughly the distance of a standard daily commute for a lot of people.
Exactly. But it gets tighter than that. The actual shipping lanes, the deep water channels where these massive, fully loaded supertankers can safely navigate without running aground, they're only about 2 miles wide in either direction.
2 miles?
Yeah, with a 2-mile buffer zone in between.
2 miles wide. For ships that are essentially floating skyscrapers, some of them stretching over 1,000 feet long.
And the volume of energy that is forced through that tiny 2-mile wide valve every single day is staggering. We're talking about 20 to 21 million barrels of crude oil and condensate passing through daily.
Wait, before we move on, you mentioned condensate. For someone who just thinks of oil as the thick black stuff in steel barrels, what exactly is that and why does it matter?
That's a great question. Condensate is a very light, highly volatile liquid hydrocarbon. It exists as a gas underground, but it condenses into a liquid when brought to the surface.
Okay.
It's incredibly valuable because it's much easier to refine into high-demand products like gasoline and jet fuel compared to heavy crude.
That makes sense.
So when we talk about 20 to 21 million barrels of crude and condensate, we are talking about the premium ingredients of the global economy. To put that into perspective, that volume represents roughly 21% of all the petroleum liquids consumed on the entire planet every single day.
Wow.
1 in 5 drops of oil used globally goes through that 2-mile wide strait.
That is a terrifying bottleneck.
Yeah.
And it isn't just liquid oil, right?
No, it's not. It also facilitates around 20 to 22% of the world's seaborne liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
Which powers basically everything.
Exactly. This is the fuel that powers electrical grids across Europe and Asia. So when you hear reports of military activity in the Strait of Hormuz, you are not just hearing about a regional skirmish. You are hearing a direct existential threat to the very lifeblood of global industry transportation and basic electrical generation.
And unfortunately, the threat is no longer theoretical. The maritime intelligence data we have specifically from Windward and Scud are painting an incredibly grim picture of the reality on the water right now.
It's chaos out there.
Total chaos. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards have formally declared that the Strait of Hormuz is closed to transit. They have broadcasted warnings that any vessel attempting to pass through will be considered a valid military target, and they are absolutely making good on that threat.
The transition from verbal warnings to confirmed physical damage has happened at lightning speed. The Joint Maritime Information Center, alongside Windward's satellite tracking data, confirms that multiple merchant vessels have been struck within just a 36-hour window.
Let's go through these specific vessel strikes because the details here are chilling and they tell us a lot about the nature of this blockade. First, we have the MKD Xiam.
Right.
This is a Marshall Islands flagged crude tanker, and it was carrying a full load of gasoline. It suffered a direct projectile strike right above the waterline. There was an immediate engine room explosion, and tragically, the reports confirm 1 crew fatality.
Think about the human element there for a moment. You have civilian sailors, merchant mariners who are essentially driving a massive floating bomb, a ship full of gasoline,
Yeah.
and they are navigating through a 2-mile channel while actively being targeted by military-grade projectiles.
It's an absolute nightmare scenario for those crews. Then we have the Skylight. Now, this is an interesting one. The Skylight is actually a sanctioned chemical tanker with known links to Iran itself.
Which is wild.
It really is. It was hit about 5 nautical miles north of Kasab in Oman. There was a major fire on board. 4 crew members were seriously injured, and 20 had to be emergency evacuated.
And the list continues. There is the Hercules Star, a Gibraltar-flagged commercial tanker that was confirmed struck off the coast of the UAE.
Just one after another.
And another vessel, the Celadonna, which has a very complex mixed profile of Western ownership, but deep Russian trade ties. The physical strike on the Celadonna is still unverified, but heavy electronic warfare indicators were observed all around it.
What's terrifying to me is the sheer randomness of this target list. You have a neutral vessel, a Western-aligned vessel, a Russian-linked vessel, and even a sanctioned Iranian-linked vessel, all getting hit within hours of each other. It doesn't seem like there's a specific target profile at all.
What's fascinating here is exactly that lack of discrimination. If you analyze the targeting pattern, it completely contradicts the idea of selective affiliation-based targeting.
So they aren't looking for specific flags.
No, they aren't just looking for American flags or Israeli-owned ships. This is a classic military strategy known as area denial.
Area denial, okay.
The goal isn't necessarily precision strikes against specific political enemies. The goal is to create an environment so chaotic, so unpredictable, and so inherently dangerous that all commercial traffic is paralyzed, regardless of nationality, destination, or cargo. They are turning the strait into a no-go zone through pure, indiscriminate unpredictability.
And it's not just physical projectiles flying through the air.
Mm-hmm.
The electronic warfare happening right now is at a scale we haven't seen in commercial shipping.
It's unprecedented.
The intelligence briefs report that over 1,100 ships in the Middle East Gulf have suffered from severe GPS jamming and spoofing in just the last 24 hours.
To understand how dangerous that is, you have to realize that modern shipping relies entirely on the automatic identification system, or AIS and GPS.
Right. They don't navigate by the stars anymore.
Exactly. When a signal is spoofed, it's not just that the GPS goes blank, it's that the system actively feeds the ship's computer false coordinates. Navigational systems are going completely haywire.
Which is terrifying in a 2-mile channel.
Windward's data shows vessels operating in the deep water of the Gulf suddenly registering their locations on dry land at international airports, or in one case, hovering over a nuclear power plant.
Imagine being the captain of a fully loaded supertanker. You are trying to pilot a massive sluggish vessel through a 2-mile-wide channel. Missiles are flying, and you look at your screen and it tells you you're currently parked on a runway in Dubai.
You are functionally blind.
It is a profound logistical nightmare. And the risk isn't just confined to the open water of the strait itself. The vulnerability extends right into the supposedly safe harbors of regional ports. Look at the Stena Imperative.
Oh yeah, the Stena Imperative case is a huge red flag.
This is a U.S. flag tanker. It wasn't actively transiting the strait. It was moored at the Khalifa bin Salman port in Bahrain. It had actively gone dark on its tracking systems days prior to avoid detection, and it was still struck by 2 projectiles while completely stationary at the berth.
That completely shatters the risk calculus for any shipping company. You aren't even safe when you are parked in an allied nation's port.
Not at all.
And we're seeing deep instability inside Iran's own infrastructure as well, aren't we? The documents note active fires, including one aboard a berth vessel at Iran's Bandar Abbas port. That's their principal naval and commercial port.
Oh, yes. There is a massive concentration of military vessels there, suggesting a highly defensive, heavily mobilized posture. The entire region is just a powder keg, and any spark, accidental or intentional, sets off a new chain reaction.
Which is exactly why commercial transit has, for all intents and purposes, completely stopped. The maritime corridor might not be legally formally closed by international maritime law, but functionally, operationally, it is a closed body of water.
Basically, a wall has come down.
Major global operators like Hapag-Lloyd and CMA-CGM have immediately suspended all transit. We now have hundreds of vessels just drifting, dropping anchor, and holding position in the Gulf of Oman, absolutely refusing to enter.
And they can't just sit there forever. Every hour, a massive supertanker idles in the ocean. It costs the operator tens of thousands of dollars in fuel crew costs and lost opportunity.
It adds up incredibly fast.
which is the perfect bridge into the economic reality of this crisis. We've established that the physical choke point is paralyzed by military action. But now we need to look at the global shockwaves. We need to examine the economics of a blockade because, as the Triton Logistics Brief so aptly points out, the corridor isn't just closed by missiles, it is closed by economics.
The invisible barrier.
Right. Let's start with the most immediate visceral reaction of the global oil market.
The reaction there was instantaneous. The moment the news of the initial strikes and the IRGC's declaration of closure hit the wires, Brent crude, which is the major global benchmark for oil prices, surged past $80 a barrel.
Just shot right up.
This is the highest level we've seen since July of 2024. But you have to understand the $80 mark is just the initial panic pricing. The markets are desperately trying to price in a reality where 20 million barrels of oil simply don't show up to the global market tomorrow.
And the projections for what happens if this drags on for weeks rather than days are, frankly, terrifying. The economic modeling from the Federal suggests that if we see a complete 30-day closure of the strait, we could see oil prices skyrocket to $150 to $200 per barrel.
Which would be catastrophic.
We are talking about the most severe oil price shock ever witnessed, far surpassing the embargoes of the 1970s.
To understand why the price would jump that high, you have to look at the insurance and logistics nightmare unfolding on the water. When a maritime zone is declared a war risk area by the Joint War Committee in London, marine insurance premiums don't just inch up, they explode.
They just go vertical.
Normally, a standard war risk premium for transiting the relatively calm waters of the Gulf might sit around 0.05% to 0.15% of the cargo's total value. Right now, those premiums have surged to 2% to 3%.
Let's do the math on that so the listener can grasp the scale. If I'm a shipping company moving a very standard supertanker carrying, say, 2 million barrels of crude oil, at $80 a barrel, that cargo alone is worth $160 million.
Exactly. And a 3% premium on $160 million means you are suddenly paying an additional $4.8 million just in insurance.
$4.8 million, just to cross a 21-mile gap.
Just for the privilege of sailing through that specific stretch of water, it makes the voyage entirely economically unviable for many operators. And that's assuming you can even get coverage. Many maritime insurers are simply issuing notices of cancellation, completely refusing to underwrite the risk at any price.
So if you can't go through the strait and you can't use the Suez Canal because of the ripple effects and the ongoing Red Sea issues with the Houthis that have been festering for years, what do?
You really only have one choice.
You take the long way around. You bypass the Middle East entirely. We've seen this happen briefly during previous crises, but we need to emphasize just how punishing the Cape of Good Hope reroute is to the global supply chain.
It is a massive structural tectonic shift for global trade. Rerouting a ship from Asia to Europe around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, adds roughly 3,500 to 4,000 nautical miles to the journey.
That's a massive detour.
In terms of sheer time, you are looking at 10 to 14 additional days of sailing at sea, depending on the speed of the vessel and the weather conditions.
And time is literally money in logistics. You have ships burning significantly more fuel to cover those extra 4,000 miles. You have millions of shipping containers suddenly tied up on the water for an extra 2 weeks, which means they aren't returning to ports in China to pick up the next load.
It's a compounding problem.
You create a sudden, massive artificial shortage of vessel and container availability simply because all the ships are taking longer to complete their loops. And the shipping lines aren't just benevolently eating those costs.
No, they pass them directly to the consumer. The logistics reports show that ocean carriers are immediately slapping on emergency conflict surcharges ranging from $2,000 to $4,000 per single container.
And here's where it gets incredibly real for you, the listener. It is incredibly easy to view oil prices as an abstract number on a ticker tape or a container surcharge as a problem for a multinational corporation. But petroleum is the foundational ingredient of modern human life.
It touches everything.
It really does. Think about crude oil, not just as the gasoline you put in your car, but as the flour in a global bakery. If the price of flour quadruples overnight, it's not just the price of a standard loaf of bread that goes up. It's the pastries, the cakes, the thickening agents in the sauces, the breading on the chicken. Everything changes.
That's a great analogy.
When the price of crude doubles and the cost to ship a container quadruples, the downstream effects hit your wallet with brutal speed. Let's break down the specific sector impacts detailed in these economic reports. Take aviation, for example.
Right. The Gulf region produces a massive, disproportionate amount of the world's refined jet fuel. The economic modeling estimates that we will see severe aviation fuel shortages globally within 14 to 21 days of a sustained closure.
Just 2 to 3 weeks.
And the cost of whatever fuel is available is projected to spike by 40% to 60%.
That means immediate widespread route cancellations. It means massive spikes in commercial ticket prices. But more importantly, it means severe disruptions to air cargo. All the high-value, time-sensitive goods, electronics, certain pharmaceuticals, critical machinery parts that move by air are suddenly grounded or priced out of the sky. And look at the petrochemical sector.
This is where the flour and the bakery analogy really shines. The Gulf region supplies 22% of the world's ethylene capacity and 31% of global polyethylene production. These are the fundamental chemical building blocks of plastic.
You might think, okay, big deal, my plastic water bottle costs 10 cents more. But it goes so much deeper than that.
Yeah, exactly. A sustained disruption means plastic resin prices could shoot up 35% to 50% within 60 days. This affects the manufacturing casing of every piece of electronics you own. It affects the lightweight components in automotive parts.
And medical supplies too, right?
But most critically, it impacts medical-grade plastics. 5V bags, sterile syringes, surgical tubing, and the blister packaging required for global pharmaceutical distribution.
And perhaps the most frightening downstream effect detailed in these reports, agriculture. The Gulf region isn't just oil. It is a massive producer of ammonia and urea fertilizers, representing about 15% of the global nitrogen fertilizer trade. The sources predict fertilizer prices will spike 25% to 30% almost immediately.
And the timing of this is critical. This price shock hits right as farmers in the Northern Hemisphere are looking toward the 2026-2027 planting seasons. Higher fertilizer costs mean farmers use less of it.
Makes sense.
Using less fertilizer means significantly lower crop yields per acre. That places massive immediate stress on global food security, particularly for staple crops like wheat and rice, and guarantees double-digit food inflation at your local grocery store within months.
The financial markets understand exactly what these cascading downstream effects mean, which is why we saw an absolute bloodbath on the trading floors on March 4th. Wall Street crashed violently. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted over 900 points, and the tech-heavy Nasdaq dipped by 2%. Investors are liquidating anything perceived as risky and hoarding safe haven assets.
But while Wall Street took a hit, the impact on the Indian markets was particularly catastrophic. The Sensex plunged by over 1,065 points to close at roughly 82,180.
And we need to clarify that closing number masks the sheer panic of the day. There was an intraday drop, meaning the massive swing in value between the opening bell and the closing bell, before some late buying stabilized it, of nearly 1,700 points.
It was a free fall.
Sheer panic seemed to take over the trading floor. The nifty Y50 went down 385 points. And when you look closely at which specific companies took the biggest hits, the profound geopolitical exposure of the Indian economy becomes glaringly obvious.
Let's look at a prime example, Larsen & Toubro, or L&T. They are an Indian multinational conglomerate, massive in construction and engineering. Their stock dropped 4.4% in a single day.
Wow.
Why? Because according to investment bank Macquarie, a staggering 37% of L&T's entire global order book comes directly from the Middle East. They are building massive infrastructure, refineries, and transport projects across the Gulf.
So the future revenue is just tied up in a war zone.
When the region goes to war, over a third of their future revenue is suddenly in extreme jeopardy. You also saw heavyweights like Tata Steel drop around 7%, and Tata Motors passenger vehicles fall over 5%.
The key insight here is the illusion of geographic distance in modern investing. A missile strikes a port in the Persian Gulf, and an Indian construction workers' pension fund loses substantial value before lunch. Geopolitics is no longer over there on a map. It's actively eroding the value in your portfolio.
The world is too connected for it to just be over there.
And while the stock market is crashing, the currency markets are screaming. Investors rushed to the US dollar as a traditional safe haven, which caused the Indian Rupee to absolutely crater. It slumped 69 paise, meaning 69 1/100ths of a rupee, a massive single-day move in currency markets to hit a record all-time low of 92.18 against the US dollar.
And that currency devaluation acts as a brutal double whammy for the Indian economy. Not only is the global price of oil significantly more expensive in dollar terms, but India's domestic currency now has vastly less buying power to purchase those expensive dollars to buy that oil.
Which brings us to the absolute core of this deep dive. We've established the global context, the shipping chaos, and the market panic.
All right.
But now we need to look specifically at India's unprecedented systemic exposure to this crisis and rigorously evaluate the defense mechanisms the country supposedly has in place.
The depth of India's dependency on this specific geographic region is structural and it is immense. Let's lay out the sheer scale of the problem. India is the world's third largest oil importer. They import between 88% and 90% of their total domestic crude oil requirement.
90%.
They do not have the domestic production to survive alone. And crucially, 45% to 50% of that massive total import volume comes straight through the Strait of Hormuz.
We are talking about roughly 2.5 million barrels of oil every single day that must physically pass through a 2-mile-wide waterway that is currently being targeted by military-grade missiles.
And the dependency doesn't stop at crude oil. India is heavily reliant on the Gulf for refined gases as well. Roughly 83% of India's liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG, which is the primary cooking gas used in millions of Indian households daily, and 56% of its liquefied natural gas, LNG, rely on routes intrinsically linked to Hormuz.
The numbers are staggering.
Furthermore, Qatar is the single largest LNG supplier to India, and we have reports that Qatar Energy has temporarily paused LNG production due to the sheer proximity of attacks to their facilities.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because when a crisis hits the Middle East, the global media focus is almost entirely on energy imports, oil, gas, fuel. But the economic analyses highlight a massive, often ignored vulnerability on the other side of the ledger.
The exports.
Yes, it's not just what India buys from the Middle East, it's what they sell to them. Over $40 billion in non-oil exports from India to the Middle East are now at immediate risk due to this supply chain paralysis.
That is a critical point. We are talking about engineering goods, pharmaceuticals, bulk chemicals, textiles, and massive quantities of agricultural products like basmati rice. These exports rely entirely on stable, predictable maritime connectivity between major Indian ports like Nhava Sheva and Mundra and the Gulf destinations.
And when those routes close, it destroys what financial analysts call working capital cycles. An Indian textile manufacturer buys raw materials, makes the clothes, and puts them on a ship. They don't get paid until those clothes arrive in Dubai.
The cash is tied up on the ocean.
If that ship is parked in the ocean for an extra month, that manufacturer's out of cash for an extra month. They can't pay their workers, they can't buy more materials. Extended transit times ruin perishable cargo like rice, but they also devastate India's overall export competitiveness on the global stage.
So given this staggering multi-layered exposure, the question on every policymaker and citizen's mind is, how long can India survive a total blockade of the strait? What is the actual buffer? The Union Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas, Hardeep Singh Puri, has publicly stated that India is well-stocked and reasonably comfortable in terms of inventories to handle short-term disruptions.
Right, but I think we need to aggressively break down the actual physical numbers behind that political reassurance. What does well-stocked actually mean in days and barrels when you're burning millions of barrels a day?
We need to look at the SPR.
The reports provide a very detailed look at India's strategic petroleum reserves, the SPR. For those who don't know, an SPR isn't just a bunch of metal tanks in a field. These are massive, highly engineered underground rock caverns designed to hold millions of barrels of crude securely.
Exactly. And the data shows India has roughly 100 million barrels of commercial crude stock overall. The actual government-controlled SPR is split across 3 massive underground facilities: Visakhapatnam in Andhra Pradesh, with a 1.3 million ton capacity, Mangaluru in Karnataka with 1.5 million tons, and Padur, also in Karnataka, with 2.5 million tons.
Okay, let's do the math on air.
That is a total SPR capacity of 5.33 million tons.
5.3 million tons sounds like a massive number, but India imports nearly 5 million barrels of oil a day total.
And that is the terrifying reality of the math. That 5.33 million tons only covers about 9.5 days of India's total crude oil requirement.
Just 9.5 days.
The real buffer comes when you add in the commercial storage facilities operated by the oil marketing companies, the companies actually refining and selling the fuel. When you combine the government SPR with the corporate OMC storage, The total national capacity equals about 74 days of cover.
74 days total.
The breakdown looks roughly like this: 25 days of crude oil stock waiting to be refined, 25 days of already refined petroleum products like petrol and diesel, and about 25 to 30 days of LPG stock for cooking.
74 days. I'm going to push back on that being a comfortable buffer. 74 days sounds like a decent amount of time on a spreadsheet, assuming a perfectly rational, evenly distributed rationing system.
Which never happens.
But realistically, doesn't that assume human beings act logically during a crisis? The moment the news breaks that the strait is closed for a month, you're going to see panic hoarding. Every gas station in Delhi, Mumbai, and Bangalore will have a mile-long line. People will fill up every car, every jerry can. That 74-day supply could functionally evaporate from the commercial market in a matter of weeks.
That is exactly the behavioral economics variable that spreadsheets can't fully account for. Panic buying massively accelerates the depletion curve. And context is everything here. How does India's 74-day best-case buffer compare globally?
How are other countries doing?
The intelligence notes that China, for instance, has an estimated 90 to 120 days of strategic reserves. They have spent the last decade aggressively, quietly building massive emergency stockpiles precisely for a moment like this. India has plans on paper to build more facilities at Chandigarh and expand the Padur site to add another 6.5 million tons of capacity, but they are currently seeking public-private partnership investments to fund it at a cost of over 14,000 crore rupees.
They're not built yet. They aren't ready.
This raises an important question. What happens on day 75? If the conflict drags on, what is the actual contingency plan? Because an SPR is meant to act as a shock absorber for a short-term disruption, not replace a permanent structural deficit in your national energy supply.
The contingency plan is a massive panic scramble for alternative sources and frantic high-stakes diplomacy. And before we talk about buying oil from elsewhere, we have to pause and look at the human element here because it is staggering. There are 1 crore, that is 10 million Indian nationals currently living and working in the Gulf region.
10 million people. That is roughly the entire population of Sweden, currently situated in what is rapidly becoming an active war zone.
Prime Minister Modi has been on the phone with the Sultan of Oman and the Crown Prince of Kuwait, trying to assess regional security and ensure the welfare of the Indian diaspora. The Ministry of External Affairs is actively assisting citizens. But let's reflect on the sheer terrifying logistics of that.
An evacuation of that size.
In 1990, India executed the largest civilian evacuation in history, airlifting 170,000 Indians out of Kuwait. They made a movie about it. It was a Herculean effort. Now imagine trying to evacuate 10 million people while missiles are actively destroying airport infrastructure. It's functionally impossible. The diplomatic imperative to de-escalate is driven as much by the safety of those 10 million lives as it is by the price of oil.
And while that diplomatic crisis unfolds, the energy ministries are looking across the globe to physically bypass the Strait of Hormuz. If they can't get oil from the Gulf, where do they get it? They're looking to West Africa, to Latin America, to Brazil, and to the United States.
Expanding the search radius.
They might even try to aggressively absorb shipments of Russian Urals crude that are currently floating in the Arabian Sea without firm buyers. But replacing Gulf barrels comes with a brutal, unavoidable logistical reality.
Right, because geography doesn't magically change just because you sign a new purchase contract in Washington and Brasilia. If India buys oil from Saudi Arabia or Iraq, the maritime voyage takes about 7 days. If they have to suddenly source that exact same volume of oil from the Atlantic Basin, the U.S. Gulf Coast, Brazil, West Africa, that voyage takes 25 days or more.
And that massive increase in transit time changes everything. It requires immense lead time. You have to order the oil a month before you need it. It requires a massive increase in freight exposure because you are tying up a ship for 50 days round trip instead of 14.
So the costs just multiply.
And it results in significantly higher landing costs. You are fundamentally paying a massive premium for the geography alone, assuming you can outbid European buyers who are also desperately scrambling for those exact same Atlantic barrels.
Which perfectly illustrates the deep structural risk of global trade and leads us into the next phase of our analysis, the reshaping of global trade corridors and the specific existential dilemma facing the IMZ project. We have to understand the fundamental flaws of modern supply chains. Over the last few decades, global trade optimized entirely for one metric: efficiency.
Just-in-time delivery.
The goal was just-in-time delivery. Why pay to warehouse a million microchips for a month when you can time the ship to arrive the exact day the factory needs them?
It maximized corporate profit, absolutely. But in doing so, we completely eliminated slack from the global system.
It's like walking a high wire without a safety net, because maintaining the net was deemed too expensive for quarterly earnings. When a choke point like Hormuz violently closes, the system doesn't have the slack to gracefully absorb the shock. You might think, well, if the strait is closed, just use the pipelines or route it up through the Suez Canal. But the data shows exactly why that doesn't work.
It's a high-stakes game of musical chairs, but half the chairs are missing. Let's look at the alternatives. The Suez Canal, even if you can safely reach it past the Red Sea threats, is physically limited to about 5.5 million barrels per day northbound. The East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia, which was built specifically to bypass Hormuz and pump oil to the Red Sea coast, has a maximum nameplate capacity of about 5 million barrels per day.
5 million. But we need 20.
But remember, our earlier number, we were trying to replace 20 to 21 million barrels per day. The physical diameter of the pipes and the width of the canals simply cannot handle the diverted volume. The math simply does not work.
This glaring, unfixable geographic vulnerability brings us to the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, heavily referred to as IMS. This was supposed to be the great modern connectivity blueprint of the 21st century, championed heavily by the US, the EU, India, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. It was designed as a massive multimodal transport route. We are talking integrated railways, shipping lanes, high-speed data cables, and even green hydrogen pipelines designed to seamlessly connect India to Europe across the Arabian Peninsula.
And crucially, it was also widely seen in geopolitical circles, particularly by Washington and Brussels, as a strategic, Western-backed counterbalance to China's massive Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
But the current war has laid bare the catastrophic geographic vulnerabilities of IMX's original design. Let's physically trace the planned route on a map for the listener. The original plan relied heavily on shipping goods from India's west coast to the UAE's Khalifa port. But Khalifa port is located inside the Persian Gulf. To get a ship from Mumbai to Khalifa port, you still have to cross the now-closed Strait of Hormuz.
The bottleneck remains. And then once the goods hit the UAE, the proposed railway network was supposed to cross the deserts of Saudi Arabia and Jordan to finally reach Israel's Haifa port on the Mediterranean Sea, where it would be loaded back onto ships for Europe.
What Israel is at war.
Exactly. Israel is currently fighting an active multi-front war with missiles incoming daily, making the Haifa segment physically dangerous and politically inoperable for regional partners.
So the entrance is blocked and the exit is a war zone. And the irony gets even richer when you reach Europe. The envisioned European entry point for all these IMBEC goods was the Piraeus port in Greece. But Piraeus is 67% owned by COSCO Shipping. And COSCO is a massive Chinese state-owned enterprise.
So the grand narrative of IMEC being a robust BRI alternative to counter Chinese influence is severely, almost comically complicated when your primary multi-billion-dollar European gateway is quite literally owned and operated by the Chinese government.
So what does this all mean for the future of IMS? Is the project just dead on arrival, a multi-billion-dollar pipe dream that died the moment the first missile flew? The think tank analysis from Trends Research suggests it isn't completely dead, but it must be radically reshaped. We have to fundamentally pivot the map. Instead of relying on ports trapped inside the Persian Gulf, the focus must shift southward to Oman.
Oman is the geopolitical winner here. They are the only Gulf Cooperation Council state with direct, unimpeded access to the open Indian Ocean, completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. Ports like Salalah Duke and Sohar are suddenly the most strategic, highly coveted maritime real estate in the entire Middle East.
And we are already seeing massive infrastructure moves in this direction. Oman and the UAE are aggressively pushing forward with the Hafid Rail project. This will connect the Omani port of Sohar directly into the UAE's internal railway network, effectively creating a permanent rail-based bypass around the Strait of Hormuz.
But the geopolitical complexities of moving goods don't end there. If you want to bypass not just Hormuz, but also the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the entire volatile Red Sea corridor, there are even more radical sci-fi level ideas being proposed by engineers. We're looking at proposals for a $4 billion bridge or potentially a massive underwater tunnel connecting Saudi Arabia directly to Egypt's Sinai Peninsula across the Red Sea. It would physically link the Arabian Peninsula to North Africa, bypassing maritime choke points entirely.
But the ultimate irony here, which the new security beat analysis points out beautifully, is how the Gulf nations themselves are playing this high-stakes geopolitical game. The US and the EU desperately want IMC to be a direct rival to China's BRI, a line in the sand, but But the Gulf nations, specifically Saudi Arabia and the UAE, absolutely refuse to view this as a zero-sum game.
They are remaining highly active, deeply invested participants in both initiatives simultaneously. They are happily taking Western investments in technology for IM while simultaneously accepting billions in Chinese infrastructure investments for BRI projects. They are maximizing their own economic leverage and national security by playing both sides of the new Cold War against each other.
Which highlights a fundamental, undeniable truth of international relations. Nations act in their own immediate self-interest, especially during a crisis. And that brings us to our final, deeply complex segment, the climate paradox. How does a massive, destructive war over fossil fuel choke points impact the global transition to green energy? Do we double down on the security of oil, or do we accelerate the transition to sustainability?
What stands out to you when you think about how nations or even individuals react in a moment of pure panic? When a massive storm hits and the power goes out in your neighborhood, you don't sit in the dark and start researching long-term solar panel installation for your roof. You drive to the hardware store and buy a diesel generator.
Exactly. Immediate survival always trumps long-term planning. And that is exactly the paradox playing out on a massive global scale right now.
When immediate baseline energy security is violently threatened, nations instantly default to securing fossil fuels at all costs, regardless of the carbon output and regardless of the long-term climate commitments they signed in Paris or Glasgow. We saw this exact same behavioral pattern mirror the global reaction to the outbreak of the Ukraine war in 2022. European nations that champion green energy suddenly fired their dormant coal plants back up, and the global scramble to secure massive shipments of LNG intensified to historic levels.
And there's a massive socioeconomic hurdle to a sudden forced transition that policymakers often gloss over. The statistics show that approximately 48% of the global energy-related workforce depends entirely on traditional fossil fuel energy sectors. You cannot force a sudden overnight transition away from oil without threatening massive, deeply destabilizing job losses across entire regions.
But, and this is crucial, the analyses from Sara Energy highlight a distinct silver lining. There is a medium to long-term accelerator effect. In the immediate panic of the first 0 to 3 months, the policy is entirely about securing oil. But looking out 3 to 12 months and beyond this crisis provides undeniable, agonizing, multi-billion-dollar proof that dependence on imported fossil fuels from volatile regions is an unviable existential national security risk. It forces the hand of conservative policymakers who previously dragged their feet on renewables.
And India is actually in a surprisingly strong strategic position to capitalize on this accelerator effect, aren't they?
Yes, they are. According to the data, India currently has its lowest dependence on imported renewable energy equipment in years, having heavily subsidized domestic manufacturing. They had record-setting solar grid installations throughout 2023 and 2024, continued massive government support for state-led wind energy projects, and critically, they entered this crisis with strong foreign exchange reserves to weather the immediate fiscal storm of expensive oil while they pivot.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this crisis dramatically elevates the diplomatic and moral power of the global South. Look at the upcoming COP30 climate summit taking place in Brazil. The geopolitical briefs suggest that major developing economies like India and Brazil can and will leverage this exact crisis to aggressively demand that developed Western nations step up and actually finance a just energy transition. They can point to the burning tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, the crippled global supply chain, and say, this is the true cost of maintaining the fossil fuel status quo. You built this system. You must help us fund the alternative.
And the long-term visionary blueprint for projects like IMEC could fundamentally evolve. Imagine replacing the incredibly vulnerable fleet of crude oil tankers slowly navigating the Strait of Hormuz with a massive secure undersea pipeline moving clean green hydrogen produced by solar farms in India and the Middle East, pumping it directly into the industrial heart of Europe. It perfectly aligns national energy security with global climate sustainability, entirely bypassing the volatile geopolitical choke points of the 20th century.
It is a profound paradigm-shifting transition. We have covered an immense, heavy amount of ground today. Let's try to synthesize exactly what we've unpacked in this deep dive. We have literally traced the physical path of a missile strike in the Middle East, watched it functionally paralyze a 21-mile-wide waterway, and tracked those economic shockwaves as they caused a 40% spike in the cost of commercial jet fuel, plummeted the Indian Rupee to record historical lows, and forced a total panicked reevaluation of how the entire world ships its goods and powers its cities.
It is a stark, unforgiving reminder of the extreme fragility of the choke point economy. What we are watching unfold in real time right now are the absolute breaking limits of globalized efficiency. For decades, we built a complex global supply chain optimized perfectly for peacetime. We assumed the seas would always be safe, the straits would always be open, and fuel would always flow. That fundamental assumption has just been violently shattered.
And that brings me to a final provocative thought I want to leave you with. I want you to address this directly to yourself as you go about the rest of your day. Look at the products in your home and watch the news. The intelligence reports and economic briefs we unpack today repeatedly mention the massive struggle to adapt these highly efficient, just-in-time supply chains to this sudden violent crisis. But consider this. If relentless optimization, the constant trimming of fat, and the endless pursuit of cheap, perfectly timed logistics bred this exact catastrophic vulnerability, what if the ultimate consequence of this war isn't just a forced transition to green energy?
It's a fundamental shift in how we trade.
Yes, what if we are actively witnessing the complete death of the globalized supply chain as we know it? What if the future of international trade requires abandoning the concept of efficiency entirely? We may be entering an era that forces countries and massive corporations to hoard massive localized redundancies. They will have to build 3 factories instead of 1 and warehouse 6 months of inventory instead of 6 days. And that means every single product you buy in the future, the smartphone in your pocket, the life-saving medicine in your cabinet, the food on your table, will be significantly permanently more expensive. Not because of inflation, but simply because the massive cost of geopolitical insurance will have to be permanently baked into the price tag of modern life. Something to deeply mull over.
A fascinating and deeply sobering thought to end on.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly complex, vital journey today. Stay curious, keep questioning the invisible systems built around you, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.